support the Guardian Angels see their cause as a positive and optimistic movement embodying concerned youth who have taken a direct role in making the inner city a safe place to inhabit once again. Others are not quite so optimistic. Indeed, there are those who see the Guardian Angels as yet another ominous sign of a decaying society. Some even go so far as to claim that the Guardian Angels are the forerunners of fascism, invoking a vigilante spirit in America's youth. Whichever end of the spectrum of opinion you find yourself on, you can wager that tonight's discussion will be both enlightening and enjoyable. Our main speaker for tonight's event is Mr. Curtis Sliwa. He's the founder and current leader of the Guardian Angels. Founded in 1979 in New York City, the Guardian Angels have grown steadily in membership and have initiated chapters in various cities, including Boston, New Orleans, and Chicago. Mr. Sliwa will touch upon the philosophy and objectives of the Guardian Angels. He will address the obstacles he has faced, as well as some of the successes his organization has attained. Once he has concluded, our remaining panelists will respond to his comments. Our first respondent will be Professor James Q. Wilson, Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government here at Harvard University. Our second respondent will be Professor Mark Moore, Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice and Public Policy Management here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Once the responses have been concluded, questions will be entertained from the floor. And so without any further delay, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Mr. Curtis Sliwa.
Let us examine first the Guardian Angels and the reason that they came into existence. A lot of people naturally would assume that, oh, this young guy from New York City, Curtis Sliwa, he must have been mugged, maybe his mom was shot, his dad was robbed. Something of a traumatic situation must have occurred in his family to have gotten him to the point where he's focused all his energies in his life towards this crime prevention role. Well, nothing like that happened at all. I grew up in a white middle-class area of Brooklyn. Really never had any of those major problems. Didn't have anybody break into my house. Nobody assaulted my loved ones. But I was very much aware in living in New York City of the problems of crime in the neighborhoods. And it always dawned upon me to use the simple aspect of looking at a problem, not overcomplicating it, not intellectualizing on it, as I was hearing on the 6 o'clock news when you'd turn it on and you'd see the newscaster and it'd sound like the barbarian invasion of Rome. You'd hear about the rapes and the assaults and the murders and the killings. And you'd read in the newspapers about the excuses and the mechanisms for committing crime. And clearly it became apparent to me that the people responsible for committing these violent crimes were people just like myself, black, white, Hispanic, male, female, but generally in their early 20s or below. So I said to myself, hey, I'm not going to get caught in the syndrome of most people sitting in their homes, locked in their confines, behind the 6 locks on the door, the bars on the window, and playing with their dog, who is no longer the friend of man, but the killer of man. I said to myself, something's got to be done. But I am not going to be guilty, like we all are, of pointing fingers at our political process, who then points the fingers at the cops, who blames the judges, who blames the governor, who blames the president, who blames the prison system. This is not a solution to a problem. Yet we ourselves as people suddenly have become guilty of the same thing. When a problem comes to our front door in terms of crime, we're quick to point the finger at either the ethics of the situation, the environmental effects, the economical situation, but never dealing with the nitty-gritty. So I took the attitude, young people are committing the crimes. It's about time a program was organized that got them involved in preventing the crime, not usurping the powers of the police, but wearing a clearly identifiable uniform to let both the good and the bad clearly know what their purpose was, to patrol in groups of 8, carrying no weapons, and primarily at first concentrating on the subway system, which was an open cesspool full of crime. Well, you would have thought that I was Jesse James and the Outlaws Come to Town. The political process in New York had cardiac arrest. Big tough Mayor Ed Koch and his running mouth started spewing out words like vigilantes, paramilitaries, good Samaritans who only do good things for the cameras, but put away the cameras And this group primarily comprised of blacks and Hispanics from lower economic, crime-infested areas. Well, you know what they're going to do. They're going to put that red beret and T-shirt away and go out and mug somebody. Well, he was just saying what was on a lot of people's minds, primarily those in the power structure. The police, they acted like Pontius Pilate. Oh, we'll have nothing to do with this. Whatever happens, happens. It's beyond us. And the police units, in panic, the unions threatened to go out on strike or go down into the subway system and remove us. Now, the people, they're the ones who are putting the bloody 60 cents in that token thing to go round and round on the subway. Their idea was, hey, this is a great idea, but this is insanity. How could they possibly hope to do what trained professional police officers with guns, sticks, walkie-talkies, and attack dogs are finding impossible to do? Sure, one day they're on the front page of the daily newspaper, and the next day in the obituary columns. They called us the kamikaze heroes. But nobody was in tune with the concept. The concept was non-violence as the solution. Visible deterrence. Unity being the strength. Cross-sectional, economic, racial, religious, showing that young people were willing to go out there, not to bust drug dealers or pimps or prostitutes or tell you turn your radio off or you can't drink here or stop smoking or stop jumping up and down and playing like a maniac, but rather to interfere with the violent crimes and using what the Constitution had guaranteed every person who is a citizen, the right, when a serious felony crime is being committed, to intervene physically if necessary to detain the individual, place him under citizen's arrest, and turn him over to the authorities. But I said, wait a second, the definition of a citizen arrest is not good enough. It's no way in the world is that going to avoid us from one day either creating a problem because we've assumed that a crime is committed, or in actuality being sued because we took improper action. So the theory of the guardian angels was physical intervention could only take place when we actually saw the crime ourselves and we had a witness to it. Now, the theory began to make sense to the peoples because they actually saw it in operation. They saw that the angels were turning their cheeks to verbal abuse, physical intimidation of the worst type, people spitting in your face, throwing bottles at you, pushing you, shoving you, stepping on you. And not a physical attack on the part of the angels, not a verbal bit of retribution. People were amazed. These are the same young people from the streets who, if you looked at them the wrong way, might quite normally pull out a pistol and shoot you dead on the spot. How was this concept able to get these types of young people into that nonviolence approach to dealing with the problem? Well, we have to look at the overall purpose of the guardian angels. A lot of you are under a misconception, as many of our political and police officials are. You think that the guardian angels are there to usurp the powers of the police. You think that it's a competitive thing. You think that one day this organization might grow so vastly into the hundreds of thousands where we may actually march and declare ourselves to be the police department. Yet in reality, when you look at the focus of the group, and if you use bloody common sense, you could see that in no way, shape, or form are we attempting to compete with the police. We're trying to replace something that the police departments across America have taken away from the communities. The visible deterrent effect of somebody in a uniform who is standing there, not as a cop, but as a citizen, and saying, hey, you are not going to violate anybody's rights or property. And that's all it is, clearly a statement of that effect. Remember, we didn't take the cops off the beat. The brainiacs in the police departments across America have determined that their great panacea is that they're going to centralize all police localities. That means you'll have a centralized telephone number to call 911 and get a recording at the end when somebody's raping you or shooting you. This way, we can no longer blame the individual captains of the precincts because now they have the perfect cop-out. It's not me, it's the system. We've over-centralized the system. We've taken the cops off the beat, put them in the cars with the rolled-up windows, the radio going tat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat, and the air conditioning going on. So they become like aliens in the community. They have no distinguishment. They are not attached in any way, shape, or form to things that are happening about them. So even if they are intervening in a serious crime, there are elements in the community who perceive them to be the enemies. And then they scratch their heads and they wonder why. Why is there a rise in crime? Why is there no respect for the men in blue? Why are the youngsters adapting to the negative? So in reality, the concept of the guardian angels has its most effective approach in being something that is sorely lacking in our society today. For young people, because they are the ones going around beating up the elderly, raping, maiming, and stealing in a violent, uncontrolled pattern. Who are the role models for our youngsters in the community today? You look at the impoverished, crime-infested areas, I'll take you to any corner in America. Baltimore, St. Louis, Detroit, Los Angeles, New York, and even in some suburban communities. It's the pimps, the pushers, the dope dealers, the gangbangers, and the hoodlums. And they're standing there on the corner in all their glory, bragging about how many times they've been arrested, how many apartments they've been able to geese, and how they're getting over on society. The role model effect. And who's listening to them? Are the middle-aged and the elderly listening to them? No, they're feigning in disrespect and walking in the other direction. But the little ones, 8, 10, and 12, they've got their eyes and their ears open and they're taking it all in. These are their heroes. So you say to me, now wait a second, I don't come from an impoverished, crime-infested area. I'm part of the normal American scene, middle class. I'm an affluent American. I don't have to deal with that garbage in the street. I live in the kind of neighborhood with the house, with the green lawn, the American flag in the front, and an acre in between homes. And I say, hey, great. I say, hey, you're absolutely right. Those are not your role models, because they're not visible on the street corners. So you depend on your role models in the boob tube. Like most Americans, rich, poor, or in between, we're addicted to that TV screen. And that TV screen has created the role model effect. They haven't given us a balance. They've given us crybaby McEnroe, who at the United States Open will break his racket, cuss the officials, curse at the fact that his limousine is 15 minutes late, and demand an extra $500,000 in royalties from Puma sneakers for wearing them. So we turn the channel and we say, everyone's not like crybaby McEnroe. And we see the new superstar of the women's youth movement, Brooke Shields. And we say, oh, wow. A half hour of Brooke Shields. Get the popcorn, Pop. And for a half hour we listen. And boy, pretty smile, nice looks. And we learn how to own 4 Rolls Royces and a jacuzzi and a home in the Riviera. And how we can sign a contract to guarantee us $6 billion for the next 6 generations. And I would say, now wait a second. Can I be Brooke Shields? Can I be Crybaby McEnroe? No. So I turn the channel and I see Reggie Jackson in baseball. Me, I. Dr. J in basketball, slam dunking. Me, I. Every bloody role model for the young people is talking about me, I, as opposed to we and what we can do for society. So now we have set up a scenario where everybody has to be a superstar, where everybody has to have the limelight shine on him. So here it is, you and I, average Joe and Mary American. We can't become the Reggie Jacksons and the Brooke Shields because that's 1 out of a million. But the quickest way to big-time reputation in the community is to carry a gun. But no longer just to carry a gun. It's a question of carrying a .38, a .357 Magnum, and shooting somebody because you just didn't like the way they looked. Or selling dope. The most popular person in the community now is the guy who can offer you heroin, coke, or teas and blues. At your price, at your rate, and home delivery too. And also the guy on the corner who was busted for rape, arson, and just recently for homicide, and is walking out on the corner and bragging about it. We've offered no balance. So suddenly, out of these very same communities, and I want you to be aware that out of the beginnings of the Guardian Angels, which came primarily out of the ghetto-infested areas of the South Bronx, of areas in Brooklyn and Queens, which made up New York, you're now seeing a new phenomenon. 31 cities across America, over 2,000 members, with active patrols going out in the afternoons and evenings. And when the past 6 months, an advancement into suburban America, primarily white, primarily affluent and middle class, and dealing with the problems that are plaguing the suburbs in terms of crime. So we're no longer talking about an urban situation dealing primarily with minority peoples. Why is the concept catching on? Are we catching more muggers and rapists than cops? No, that's ludicrous. That's not our purpose. If you were to dress up like I am, like a moving lollipop, and walk around with 8 other guys and gals who look like they were delivering pizzas. How many criminals, street-hardened, tough guys and gals in their right mind are going to try to commit a crime in front of you? It's not going to happen. Sure, we are going to make a lot of people feel a lot better by being there because they know instinctively that no longer can they depend on one another. 40 or 50 years ago, as it said every night at the 5 o'clock dinner table scenario, sure, why can't it be that way? People responded to each other spontaneously. You could walk out of your house, come back 2 days later, nothing was missing, walk through the parks, don't worry about the elderly or the women or the infirm. Now grown men have to worry. We've all heard that story. Our parents have told us, our grandparents. We've read about it in history books. But we're lacking those role models. So now suddenly, young men and young women coming out of the communities, putting themselves on the line, not hiding behind some bar stool or some desk and chair and philosophizing on the reasons for crime, but rather getting actively involved, not taking a bat or a stick or a gun, but standing out there as a visible deterrent. Yes, being a target. I am more of a target than anybody walking in the street if anybody just wants to shoot me for no reason. Yet it isn't happening. There's a begrudging respect. And the overall long-term effect of the guardian angels is that positive role model effect, so that little Jane, little Sally, little Alan, little Billy now look at their own people from their community who've gone to school just like them, who used to hang out in the schoolyards, maybe didn't graduate high school, but have straightened out their life to a degree where they now have a single-minded purpose in trying to aid the community. But it isn't the kind of a purpose that's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They work, they go to school. They're required to give a minimum of 8 hours a week of patrol time. They don't think, breathe, and eat guardian angels 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We don't ask you what's your religion, who you voted for in the last presidential election, or who you might have been sleeping with the night before. It's none of our goddamn business. But we're all there for a unique purpose, to try to improve the quality of life. Not just to talk about it and blow off a lot of hot air, but to take the law that's been written, and unlike what the police department and the political officials will tell us, we do have rights, and we can have an effect. And the solution to crime is not going to come by hiring more cops and building more prisons and putting more hanging judges on and electing tougher mayors or tougher police chiefs. You could have 5,000 extra cops in Boston tomorrow and 5,000 extra guardian angels, and crime will still be on the rise, because the problems lie with you and the rest of the people out there. So we've got to have the people who are going to go out there, who are not being paid, who are putting themselves on the line, who are people just like you and me, trying to improve themselves, who are going to give a little bit of that time to their community. Your generation, forget about it. It's been infected with the me generation. It's the little ones that we've got to try to give an alternative. Not change their way of thinking totally. Sure, we want the role models of me, I. I'm not into censorship. I'm just saying we need a balance. And I feel that is the overall importance of the guardian angels. Attack us statistically in our ability to fight crime. Attack us in the motivations that you might allege as to why somebody would want to become a guardian angel. But understand the total overall effect is being felt amongst the young people now, who finally have somebody that they can look up to who's exemplifying the positive role model, yet not saying that you've got to be this way all the time. That is the greatest statement. And particularly those in a college atmosphere. I hate to be critical, but I've never been known to hold back my words. But I've met with enough people that I would call brainiacs, or people who will get very philosophical about the reasons for crime, but I'll tell you this. Economic necessity to commit crime just does not exist in America any longer. This is not the Depression. If somebody comes up and tells you that they just stole a $40 pair of sneakers, or geased your apartment and stole your stereo and your stash of dope to put food in their belly, clothes on their back, and a roof over your head, hey, forget it. You've been suckered in. Because I've been in the worst crime-infested, impoverished neighborhoods in this country. St. Louis, Houston, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Newark, Miami. In all the areas that were plagued by riots. And I'll tell you this, I never one time ran across an individual who had to commit crime to survive. But then again, that's not an excuse to say that all crime is on the lower economic level. The reason that the lower economic mentality will say, hey, doggy dog, take or be tooken, is because we up in the power structure, we in the banking community, we who control the money resources are embezzling millions of dollars, ripping off the people by taking in taxes, building highways that don't even exist, padding the payrolls. So everybody is taking that, we've got to look out for our own self kind of identity. And that's the reason for crime. And if we're all going to stay divided and on our own little islands, and the poor are going to say, I'm going to look out for myself, and the middle class are going to say, well, I'm going to look out for myself, and the rich are going to take the attitude, then we're going to have increasing crime. Because that guy who broke into your middle class home and stole your TV lived in your neighborhood and sold it back to somebody else who lived in your neighborhood. Do you really believe somebody came from outside of your neighborhood, unidentifiable, and ripped off your house and went and sold it someplace else? Most crime nowadays in the suburbs is being committed by people who live right next door to you. And everybody knows it. Most of you people are aware who ripped off your home, but nobody does anything about it. That's the real reason for crime. Public apathy. Talk is cheap. Action is where it's at. As long as it's within the confines of the law and you're not harming or damaging or physically hurting anybody. Thank you.
I thought I would try to put into some kind of historical perspective what I think from what I've heard the guardian angels are about. And let me begin by describing two traditions in American society that have coexisted, but with important differences. And this perhaps may help you ask Mr. Sliwa, I think, the right questions. The first is the vigilante tradition, and the second is the tradition of community watchmen. The vigilante tradition I would define as the tradition that says the citizens may take the law into their own hands, and by which I mean the citizens may not only deter but apprehend and punish. The United States is unique in having had a large vigilante tradition. Most European nations, in fact, no European nation of which I'm aware has had one. One scholar counted over 326 examples of vigilante groups in American history, beginning in the 1760s with the South Carolina regulators. They occurred in the United States in the frontier areas, and they occurred because people in these communities were trying to extend order to a frontier which the government had not yet reached, and to do so in the tradition of a political culture that emphasized individual rights. In Europe, the government reached the land before the people had an opportunity to exercise their rights over it, and perhaps this, as much as anything, accounts for the differences. The community watchman tradition, by contrast, did not grow up on the frontier, or at least did not begin there, and often did not extend there. It began in the earliest settlements on the eastern seaboard. It began in Jamestown and the Plymouth Plantation, later in Boston and in Philadelphia and New York. It was based on the proposition not that each citizen should take the law into his own hands, but rather that each citizen, or as it was in those days, each adult male citizen, has an obligation to contribute to the protection of a community, because without the community, the individual could not survive. Life in the early settlements was sufficiently precarious that the concept of individualism as we have come to know it today had almost no meaning, because without the community, death was the alternative. And the most serious punishment that could be imposed upon a person living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 17th and early 18th century was to be banished from the community. For over 200 years, American cities, beginning on the eastern seaboard but not limited to them, were patrolled by community watchmen, citizen volunteers. Not very different, I suppose, from the guardian angels, except that they did not exist as an ancillary to the police or as a supplement to the police. They existed in lieu of the police because the police were not invented until the 19th century. We have had fewer years of experience in this country with a professional or paid police force than we have had with a volunteer community watchman force. The police, indeed, as happened in Boston and Philadelphia, New York, grew out of the community volunteer watchman tradition. And it is ironic to me that it should be the police now that challenge that tradition, that say that citizens should play little or no role except under police direction in the protection of their own communities. It is perhaps a measure of the extent to which we have allowed our lives to be segmented into two categories: the category of individual preoccupation and self-expression on the one hand, and the category of bureaucratized institutions on the other, to which we delegate all matters that we are not concerned with handling ourselves. The community watchman tradition began to fade in the middle of the 19th century when the professional police forces first began to be formed in Boston and Philadelphia. But it was revived in 1964. To the best of my knowledge, and I may be in error on this, the first known example of the clear revival of that tradition in modern times occurred in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn when a group called the Maccabees organized to protect that community against what appeared to be a rising crime rate. And beginning in 1964 and extending throughout the 1960s and 70s, these groups grew up in white and black neighborhoods, sometimes to exercise the community watchman function, to protect the community against rising crime rates in a manner not very different from what the guardian angels do today, and sometimes to revive the vigilante tradition, that is to say, to defend the racial boundaries between alternative neighborhoods. We had examples of that perhaps in Newark and other places where people armed themselves to maintain order, literally to take the law into their own hands. With what provocation, I do not know, but the tradition of the vigilante was revived at the same time as the tradition of the community watchman. And now we come down to 1981 and the guardian angels, who, in my view, are very much in the tradition of the community watchman. But the questions I want to ask of Mr. Sliwa when he has a chance to respond are the following two. And they are questions that grow out of our experience with watchman efforts in the past. As I say, the experience with the Maccabees in the Crown Heights area in 1964, and literally hundreds, perhaps approaching 1,000 such groups that have existed in the United States since then. The first question is, how do we know they make a difference? It is perhaps the failing of we scholars that we have not gathered evidence on this question. We cannot say, to the best of my knowledge, yet, that we know that they make a difference. From Mr. Sliwa's very interesting remarks, it's clear that the difference they make has to be understood in at least two senses. They may make a difference in the community by deterring crime by virtue of their presence, a visible deterrent, as he put it, or they may not make a difference on crime, but they may make a difference in the lives of the guardian angels. They may change lives among the people they recruit. And either of those outcomes is an interesting one, and I would like to know what judgment he has as to which of these, if any, represents the biggest difference. The second question I would like to ask is, how do you maintain this group? Not now that it's growing rapidly. He told me earlier that it exists in over 30 cities and growing by leaps and bounds, and volunteers are springing up in suburban areas as well as in big city areas. But what we learned about these efforts in the 1960s and 70s in public housing projects in various communities is that after the initial enthusiasm of a few months or perhaps a year or so, these groups tended to vanish, not because the crime problem went away, in many cases it got worse, but because the ability to sustain volunteer activity of this sort, requiring people to be on the streets in small groups at night, sometimes, often perhaps in hostile surroundings, is something that most people simply cannot sustain over the long period. I think the answers to those two questions will provide us with some guidance as to what we can expect of the Angels and similar enterprises in the future. Thank you.
As is my habit, and indeed the habit of most brainiacs, I would like to echo the sentiments of the previous speakers and simply add my general approval and slight carping questions and considerations to what you've heard before. I'd like to say that I thought that Mr. Sliwa's account of the appearance and growth of the Guardian Angels, namely giving an account of that in terms of the retreat of the police from the community, echoes a very strong theme that I've come to believe in, and the lack of confidence that people have in the ability of police to control crime in their communities, or indeed to help them with any of the problems that they think are important to them, I think is a major motivation for the appearance of groups like the Guardian Angels, and a great challenge to local police departments, as well as perhaps an indictment of the particular set of strategies that they've chosen to pursue in controlling crime and delivering services. With respect to the question of vigilantes, that's the natural question to ask, and I think that Jim, by pointing out the two different traditions of community watchmen and vigilantes, made implicit in those is a rather clear line between what constitutes a community watchman and what constitutes a vigilante, and we heard in Mr. Sliwa's presentation a declaration that put him clearly on the side of community watchmen, and it seems to me that the line is drawn in two important dimensions. One is on the dimension of whether we're interested in deterrence and with minimal apprehension efforts and staying way short of sanctioning, or whether we're interested in apprehension and sanctioning. And Mr. Sliwa was quite clear to say that they were there as deterrents with a modest role on the prospect of apprehension, and that they imagine no role in the sanctioning process, and that's one important line to stay on the right side of, it seems to me. The other question is another one that was raised, and that is the kind of conduct that becomes the subject of intervention by the organized group. They're following, to a great extent, our tradition that accords great freedom of conduct in the society. We limit ourselves to those that pose the prospect of violence to strangers, and again, Mr. Sliwa clearly identified himself and his objectives as on well inside the, or I don't know exactly whether it's inside or outside, but well on the side of the line that defined him as a community watchman, indifferent to verbal slurs and primarily interested in the prospects of violent crime. So I don't think the appearance of a volunteer group necessarily need pose a apprehension about vigilantism, as long as we remain clear on the distinction between community watchmen and vigilantes, and count on the private group to remain in the tradition of community watchmen. Indeed, as I thought about this, I kept wondering why it was that we had gotten away from the tradition of largely private policing. Jim remarked that most of our tradition, most of our history, has been much more reliant on private police efforts than on public police efforts. And I think this is wrong historically, but viewed from our current perspective, what virtues we could claim for public policing, it seems to me, come from two important sources of legitimacy that we impute to public police and mistrust private policing for. One of them is an appropriate regard for the rights of the accused people, and I think that's a perpetual source of worry, but in this case, at least at the level of intention, Mr. Sliwa was quite clear about that. The other, and the more interesting one, and I think this is historically inaccurate, so I don't offer this as an explanation of why we developed public policing, but is a modern concern, and that might be a concern with equal access to protection, or to either publicly or privately supported protection. And one of the virtues of a public police department, it seems to me, and indeed one of the virtues of the Guardian Angels, is that they offer their protection indiscriminately and equally to the community. And I sometimes worry when the questions about vigilantism are raised that we will decide that the Guardian Angels are vigilantes and that the Burns Security Guard which are employed by many private people, are not vigilantes. And I wonder what the effect of making such a distinction will be on the long-run on the equality of the distribution of access to protection against crime within the community. And I would be reluctant to exclude the kind of indigenous, voluntary, private policing that Mr. Sliwa is offering, and at the same time allow a large amount of private commercial policing, and somehow rather find that the private commercial policing didn't pose any substantial threats of vigilantism. Okay, so those are some general concerns. The social scientist and the brainiac in me comes out a little bit in the question that Jim also mentioned, which is how should we evaluate whether the guardian angels are making a difference in terms of their impact on and a beneficial or a negative impact on our society. And there are three ways that I would think about that, two of them rather obvious, and the third one I think a little less obvious, and the third one by far the most important. And the three dimensions that it seems to me useful to look at in thinking about the effect of the guardian angels on the society is, one, what is their effect on violent crime among strangers? And as Mr. Sliwa says, this may well be a source of attack on the guardian angels, that there will be a series of statistical findings that come out that indicate that they have been no more effective than the police in apprehending armed robbers, maybe even less, and that they are having no appreciable effect on the observed crime rate in local communities. I would regard that as an important finding, but not definitive or determinative on the question of whether the guardian angels represent an attractive or an unattractive institutional phenomenon in the society. Second dimension that I would, in addition, want to look at is the question of what impact they've had on the fear of crime. And there, I think their impact is likely to be much greater than it is in the actual impact on crime, and equally important, because I think that if we were to balance the cost to the society of actual victimization versus the fear of victimization, I think it's at least arguable that the fear is as great a cost as the actual victimization, and that to the extent people can make a contribution to reductions in fear and reduction in hysteria, I think it will be an important effect to have achieved. And I think the angels, simply by virtue of the confidence they've attracted from various people, hold a great prospect for producing that result, if they can find some way of surviving in what was at best a difficult situation and maybe openly hostile. The third and most important area, though, is the one that I want to talk about a little bit, which is the challenge that Mr. Sliwa put to the audience this evening. And this, I think, is where the challenge for the angels, in some respect, will be, which is that perhaps the most important effect they can have is in making us all remember that we can become responsible for controlling criminal conduct. Mr. Sliwa described the special effect of the angels as being visible deterrence, and he made much of the T-shirt and the beret. He made substantially less, interestingly, of any kind of professional training that had to do with nonviolent methods or martial arts, etc. And it seems to me that what was important about the beret and the T-shirt is not that that person represents a threat to criminals, and Mr. Sliwa was again fairly, little bit uncertain, but fairly clear that they didn't represent a substantial threat to criminals, but instead what the beret and the T-shirt seemed to represent was a willingness to take social and community responsibility for that particular environment at that particular moment, to be the person that other people uncomfortable in that environment could reasonably call on to help them in a situation that they found uncomfortable. And noticing that, I noticed that maybe the greatest prospects for the angels' success and the greatest prospect for minimizing the hazards associated with the angels is for us all to remember, as Mr. Sliwa reminded us, that it's possible for each of us to become a guardian angel, for each of us to don a T-shirt or if not physically, then nonetheless in terms of our commitment, and a beret, and to begin to exercise the responsibilities of citizens along with taking advantage of the rights of citizens. And those responsibilities of citizens that Mr. Sliwa kept emphasizing to us were, one, forbearance, that we were not interested in everything, that we were restricted our attention to those things that could properly be considered of community concern, namely threats of violence among strangers, and that we would accept responsibility for intervening when we saw situations like that. So my argument would be is that if I were going to evaluate the long-term effects of the guardian angels on crime and the fear of crime and citizenship in the country, I would think that their major contribution would come from reminding all of us that you don't need to be a special kind of person to be a citizen in this society, that all you have to do is take your responsibilities of citizenship rather seriously, those responsibilities including forbearance and a communal sense of responsibility. So I'd like to thank Mr. Sliwa for being here tonight.
We'll now take questions from the audience, and in order for everyone to be able to hear your question, would you please move to the microphones that are located in the corners of the first floor and on the second floor as well. Before you begin your question, if you could please specify which member of the panel your question is being directed to. Yes.
Sure. Would you like to?
All right, Professor, could you just briefly restate the main...
What are your feelings as to what difference you're making on the streets or in the lives of your members? And secondly, how do you hope to maintain a volunteer effort over a long period of time?
Okay, well, I'd like to address the second one first. A lot of people will claim that the guardian angels are more hype than reality. And I will agree to a great degree with the Maccabees and the other groups that you had pointed out developed out of crime-plagued areas. You have to remember it was a parochialized view of crime. They were dealing with one particular community, generally protecting themselves from people they perceived of as outsiders. And having studied many of these organizations, it was very clear that once the general emphasis was achieved, where they had proved that, yes, that they could protect themselves, then there was a general loss in interest because the program had no sustenance to continue. That means it was yielded only to one particular matter. In the case of the Maccabees in Crown Heights, surrounded by a black area, the idea was to keep the blacks out. In other areas, it's been very racially motivated. That's not true of the guardian angels. As you can see in their expansion, not only are they dealing with urban situations, but suburban. Plus, it's on the effect of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-economic type grouping. There are all different types of people who are approaching the group hoping to gain entrance. Now, one of the things that the professor had mentioned was the standards necessary in being a guardian angel. And I think it's clear to understand why this concept will continue to develop, because it's not something that anybody can just join. In fact, most people could never in a lifetime hope to become a guardian angel involved on patrols, because to be so, you've got to fill out an application, get personal recommendations. We're interested in your previous activities in terms of a crime record, if any, military service record if you've been involved, educational standards, physical or mental disabilities. We want a dissertation as to why you want to be a guardian angel, not based on the 6 o'clock news or the local radio show or what you read in the Boston Globe, but your personal input as to why you want to be a guardian angel. And then a 3-month training program. Now, quite simply, anybody can be taught the martial arts. Anybody can be taught basic legal skills in terms of the rights of a citizen to make a citizen arrest according to the Penal Code of Boston and the Penal Code of the state of Massachusetts in terms of the differentiation between felonies and misdemeanors. Anybody can be trained in the medical skills of cardiopulmonary resuscitation and basic first aid life support. That much I'll agree. But the overbearing teaching process of the guardian angels throughout the 3 months is your ability to deal with verbal abuse and physical intimidation, to turn the cheek and walk in the other direction. Whether rich, poor, or in between, mom and dad will bring up their child individually, once again, to take the attitude that, hey, if you're bullied for your milk money, or somebody is passing racial slurs to you, or stopping you on your way to school or coming home, Better to throw down with that person now and maybe get your ass kicked, but at least they won't bother you any longer. But definitely don't turn your cheek and walk in the other direction. And I would have to agree with that, with the wolf pack syndrome. If there are 8 or 9 people harping on you, if you don't stand up to them individually, they're going to plague you for the rest of your life. But when you're donning a red beret and a T-shirt, and you're going out there and you're saying that you're not out there to contribute to a problem, you're actually out there to deter a problem, to be like a blanket on a fire, to smother it, then you've got to be willing to accept all types of verbal criticism and all types of physical intimidation that go beyond attacks on your very life or your very physical health, or assault and battery in that case. So that's why there are very few who are able to qualify to get through those standards. Now, what does the guardian angel concept do for the guardian angels, and how do I feel it can be most effective? I would say 50% of my delivery this evening was based on the role model effect. So you could see that I'm very strongly just taken up with the whole concept of these young men and women, primarily young men and women, because they are 16 and over. There is no top age limit. But I'd have to admit to you now that it's very rare to get a guardian angel over the age of 35. But these young people serving as positive role models is the primary, most important effect. Statistically, in terms of our effect, nobody will ever know how many crimes we've been able to deter by just being there. But logic, common sense will tell you that guardian angels are not getting shot, they're not getting killed, they're not getting assaulted, so obviously they are having an impact in deterring that kind of crime. To the guardian angels themselves, I don't think it has as much effect on the individual guardian angels as it does in terms of developing leadership amongst guardian angels. Remember, there are 31 cities now that we are active in. Curtis Sliwa stands here before a microphone at Harvard University. There are patrols out right now in those 31 cities. People making decisions, patrol leaders, people who are supervising those efforts, chapter leaders, men and women, generally young people, who previous to the guardian angels, their opinions didn't count. All of a sudden you put on a red beret and a T-shirt and people want to know what you think about an issue. You suddenly have credibility. You've got to be able to verbalize on the concept. Can you imagine going out there risking your life and not being able to explain adequately to a person's needs and desires why it is you're out there? Because you know what they're looking for. They want to hear, well, you're out there to beat up the thugs and take care of the crooks and criminals. But to hear a theory or a thought process on nonviolence and the hope to just totally eliminate a violent situation is something that is very much, well, it's not a usual phenomenon in our society today. We are a violent society. We dwell on violence. Our media is totally violent-oriented. And in fact, if you notice, a lot of the media attention to the guardian angels has been placed on martial arts skills, flying kicks, spinning back punches. And yet in reality, in 3 years, and having detained over 200 people, we've never once been threatened with a lawsuit. We've never once been even questioned about improperly detaining somebody with excessive physical force. And we've never had a guardian angel arrested because we've abridged the rights of the defendant. Unlike the police department, our training says if anybody is to be hurt in an altercation, and this may sound strange to you, if anybody is to receive a blow, or in somehow, let's say we're breaking up a brawl, let's say blacks and whites are fighting in the streets of Boston. Well, if 8 guardian angels are going to get in between them like peanut butter between 2 slices of bread, you've got to assume that we're going to get hit in the exchange. But imagine if we react like the cops, and as soon as we get hit, we start swinging back. We create a worse situation. So as a guardian angel, you know, nobody asked you to get involved. You're going out there trying to quell the violence. And that means all of a sudden you think 2 guys who are ready to break each other's heads with baseball bats are just going to drop the bats. Oh, the guardian angels are here. Let's everybody cool out. So the common sense is that, yes, you may get injured, you may have to receive a blow or 2, but you've got to maintain that control. And in detaining a person, even though they may be struggling, you may get bit, you may get punched, you may get smashed, but use the ultimate limited amount of physical force to detain them. And that's something that the police department doesn't train. Generally, they train their men and women to be John Wayne warriors. That means I got the badge, I got the gun, I got the stick. That makes me the law. You don't subscribe to the law, you're going to get either the stick or the gun or my fist. And I feel if the training was more on the nonviolent aspect of blending in with the community, there'd be far less dissension between the police department and the communities.
We're ready to go to the audience mics, and we have someone down this way.
Call 911 and you get a tape recording. I agree with you to some extent. If I may, I'd like to ask you to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's going to reorganize one of these police departments. In general terms, what are you going to do? How are you going to reorganize these police departments so that they're more receptive to the public?
All right, well, first thing, get everybody out from behind the desk, all the cops punching away the typewriters with the one finger. All we do is we need one cop in the precinct with a gun and a set of handcuffs. Everyone else can be civilians. Get the brass out onto the streets also. They should be pulling some patrol time so that they don't lose an affinity for the men and women in the street. And get at least 60% of your workforce out of the cars and into the streets in the key localities that they're needed. And naturally, in the training process, instead of training the men and the women in blue to not accept any verbal abuse or physical intimidation, explain to them that they're supposed to be peace officers. And in being a peace officer, that doesn't mean you just eliminate the first word of that. That the whole idea is to calm down a situation. And look, I've seen situations where communities have gone off on cops and they don't have an alternative but to pull that piece out and that stick. And I know a lot of cops who would say right now, well, fine for you to say. There's 8 of you people walking around. I'm stuck in the middle of a riot. I'm getting barraged from all sides. I don't have a choice. And I can sympathize with that. But I've also seen many instances where because they are a fraternal organization, that when a mistake is made, rather than admit to the mistake, they all are too interested in covering up their rear ends. Now, that may be a guilt also in the future of the guardian angels. That's something that I'm hoping to work against. And that's why in our organization, there's a policy of one strike and you're out. We're not going to allow you to continue to make the same mistakes over and over and then allow others to see that you've been able to get away with it. And that's why I think within the police department, standards have to be extreme. You make a mistake, and I think it really should cost you your job.
A question over here on microphone 1.
Yes, this is directed to Curtis Sliwa.
Yes, sir.
Curtis, my work is focused on victimization of children, and 2 weeks ago in testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Juvenile Justice, the issue of runaway children was brought out and their vulnerability to sexual exploitation. Now, the Guardian Angels have chapters in New York and Chicago, which are 2 magnet cities for runaways, which now is estimated to be at least 1 million a year. They're also a magnet for the perpetrators of child prostitution and child pornography. Now, traditionally, the agencies which are set up to deal with these children, for instance, the Under 21 Center in New York City on Times Square, which
Yes.
you may be familiar with, they're set up to handle these kids, but as probably you and I both know, I grew up in Manhattan. Runaway kids don't go looking for the social workers and the psychologists. And it seemed to me that the Guardian Angels that have a reputation for being somewhat street savvy and some credibility with young people, since they're comprised of young people, might perhaps be able to get involved in this function. And I'd like to know if the Guardian Angels would be interested in considering such a function in the future.
Well, absolutely. I think, though, you have to understand that a lot of those runaway programs, there's a great deal of attention paid to them. But when you look at the runaway programs and the people who are staying in those facilities, a lot of them are not runaways. They're just using the facilities, and it's bully, dog, bully. That means you've got a lot of gang members hanging out in there. You've got a lot of people who are selling dope during the day and using the facilities to use as a residence at night. In that situation, the strong survive and the weak are out in the streets. Every time a guardian angel patrol goes out in New York City, there's generally 2 or 3 people that they run into either in the subways or the streets who's a runaway from someplace who'd like to become a member of the guardian angels. They're looking for something to belong to. They're looking for an identity. Is there something we can do right now? Absolutely not. I can't lie to you. In the future, I would hope that we'd be able to gear a program that can try to start pulling them in off that fine line. But I'm not going to sit before you and promise you something that is absolutely out of our reach at this particular point.
Is there a question on the second floor?
Rewa, you spoke about a role model for 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and 12-year-olds, and I'm just interested in what type of feedback the guardian angels have received from groups of that age. You talked about you haven't gotten beaten up, and the fact that a lot of people are joining the guardian angels would seem to indicate that people in those areas think it's a positive thing. But you see, for example, 10-year-olds running around imitating guardian angels instead of Reggie Jackson or some type of element.
Well, surprisingly, when we'll come into a new city, a city that has not been exposed to the guardian angels other than a few 20-second blurbs on the 6 o'clock news, a few drags in a magazine or radio spots, surprisingly, it's the youngsters who know more about the guardian angels than anyone else. What's happened, a phenomenon that's taken place in the schools, is that teachers, and I've had literally thousands of letters, have used materials that have been written on the guardian angels as a tool, as a device to keep the children's attention and also improve their reading skills. So that I've actually been requested on the part of a lot of teachers to send whatever has been written about the guardian angels because the kids are dying to read up on it. And I'll go into a city like Houston or Dallas-Fort Worth or Phoenix or Tucson, and you say, wow, guardian angels. Cowboy town, Southwest. What are they going to be thinking about guardian? And I have little kids coming up, oh, well, didn't you start 3 years ago in the South Bronx? And yeah, you're on the trains, and I understand you're in Chicago. And say, I figure I'm being interviewed by a major reporter here. The reporter's looking at the kid and saying, gee, I didn't know that. You know, he's got his standard question. Are you vigilantes? The police chief and mayor say they don't want you. Why are you here? But the children seem very in tune with it. Now remember, we're not saying that we should be the overall role model. I'm never going to say that Reggie Jackson and the rest of them are totally off to one extreme, but I'm saying there should be the balance for the children to be able to determine. I feel the balance is obviously swung over to the extreme of the I-isms and the me-isms.
Yes, your question.
I'm James Ward from Boston University. I have a question for Mr. Sliwa. I have a young friend who goes to an urban high school, and you're his hero and role model. And he formed a vigilante group, much like yours, not a vigilante group, but a patrol to cut down to cut down on crime in his school. And it worked. And then earlier this year, he read of a guardian angel being arraigned for grand theft auto, for grand larceny, and it shattered his organization. And he blamed the guardian angels. His argument was they got too large. They themselves claiming the centralization of the police, well, they got too large too, and it eventually destroyed them. I don't
to me that seems to be just an organization that really had no concept of purpose. What would happen tomorrow if Curtis Sliwa was caught having, let's say, having illicit relationships with one of the co-eds here in Harvard tonight?
Well, you'd probably have an article
Well,
in the
what I'm trying to say is, let's say something very negative. Something very negative appeared about Curtis Sliwa. Now I will admit that it would be very shattering to a lot of people. And 6 months ago, I think that a lot of the group was locked in to the mentality of one person doing one thing. But for the concept to be, I mean, you got 2,000 people in their own lives. I went to a Jesuit high school with only 700 people in the whole school. When they ran record checks in New York City of the Guardian Angels, 23 of them had felony arrests. Only 23 out of 700. The police department was floored. When I went to a Jesuit high school, there were at least 100 cats who had felony arrests for sale and possession of dangerous drugs, breaking and entering, grand theft auto. And these were kids who lived in homes of $250,000 or more. So the fact of the matter is, if his concept was shattered, and I'm not aware of that, I'm surprised I'm not aware of that, but then obviously he was not working on the proper motivation. Because you don't do it because of what another group has done. You do it because it needs to be done. The concept of what he was trying to do in his school should have related to the school. I think, really, he's blaming the cause and effect on something that he should have been able to control. The young people themselves should have been in the program to improve the quality of life and the safety in the school, not based on what the guardian angels have done. That's sort of like saying, I want to be Reggie Jackson, and when you find out you can't be Reggie Jackson, you quit.
Well, thank you. I'll tell him your encouraging words.
Okay.
Your question, sir.
This question is directed at Mr. Sliwa, but I would appreciate comment.
Look, at the moment, as attractive as it may look to the ACE and to some of the members of this committee, I don't think if we go this route that anyone is going to be very happy 4 or 5 years ago. Now, I'll predict that the representative from the ACE would be here 4 or 5 years from now saying to the committee, Mr. Chairman, we're very happy about this money, but these federal guidelines, these federal inspectors are killing us. I don't think anybody wants to see that happen.
Thank you. We'll have a follow-up from Helen and then one from Jerry, and if the representative from the ACE would care to reveal what she really thinks in her heart of hearts, she'll have that opportunity as well.
Okay, I wanted to say that, well, in addition to the concerns you mentioned, I'm also concerned about the precedent of
Welcoming any kind of force that seems respectable and well organized as a common sense method to deter crime in the city of Boston. And yet we haven't seen any real action by city politicians within Boston to welcome the guardian angels or to even think about ways in which they can be incorporated, maybe even on a short-term basis, to counter the problems that the police force is facing with Proposition 2.5. So my question for the panel in general is not only for the city of Boston, but for major metropolitan cities in the United States. How can we facilitate some sort of talks and conversations between police officials and mayors of these cities with the guardian angels? How can we, as citizens, try to push our politicians into realizing that maybe common sense dictates that there's a need for this type of force, and that they, besides their role model abilities, can actually serve some usefulness within the city, because the police forces are no longer seem to be a deterrent to crime. They seem to be a force that comes in after the fact to clean up the scene of a crime.
Well, first I'd like to comment on that Proposition 2.5, which is in line with a lot of the comments of our president lately, and might lead people to think that we were Ronald Reagan's youth movement because of his, let's face it, putting a lot of emphasis on volunteer service in America. And I hear him, and I hear the Star-Spangled Banner and the flags waving, and I say, gee, isn't this great? He wants the needy to volunteer to help the greedy. Now let me explain it, because I've just indicted him. He's not talking about guardian angel safety patrols. He's talking about the same old volunteer programs that have been in effect in America since when America first began. I don't think that Mayor Kevin White or President Reagan or anyone else, it's going to be that helpful if they suddenly embrace the effort of the guardian angels. I think in many regards, by putting that much emphasis on volunteer service, it takes away from them their responsibilities to provide for the basic good and the quality of life. And it's a cop-out on their part. The fact of the matter is, government has dropped the ball. When you can't walk the streets safely, when you have to live in fear in your own homes, it's an indictment on the political process, the mayors and the police chiefs. When I can go in any community in America wearing a red beret t-shirt known as the founder and director of the Guardian Angels, a crime-fighting organization, and find out in 5 minutes where I can buy heroin, and you're telling me that the police department can't put these guys out of business, Well, I'm telling you that the government, either indirectly or directly, is profiting off the sale of drugs in the streets. And if they can't even deal with that particular problem, and it's something that I see all across the country, because a lot of the crime is definitely motivated by the sale of these very dangerous drugs like heroin. And they're not doing anything about it. Now, if all of a sudden, you can imagine if the Guardian Angels came to town and Kevin White and the political establishment openly embraced us. Well, if I was a citizen, I'd say, uh-oh, what kind of political chicanery is going on here? I'll bet you we're being taken for another ruse. I think the attitude of Kevin White and the political process in this city has been a wait-and-see attitude. I think it's healthy. I don't think a politician should side himself one way or the other initially. Because how do you know the Guardian Angels are going to deliver? Well, maybe it worked in New York. How do you know it's going to work in Boston? It's a totally different circumstance. After 4 or 6 months of a track record, then begin to make a judgment, then begin to sit down. But has been our tradition. We never approach the political figures. We always approach the people first. We're not concerned with them because we're not coming for the mayors or the police chiefs. And really, there's nothing they can do for us, to be quite fair to you. In fact, in New York, where we had a problem initially with the mayor and the police chief, we came to a memorandum of understanding with them, with the record checks, the ID cards, and the coexistent training programs, to keep them off our back because they were harassing us. And it was something that the people wanted. But in terms of us operating, sure, we'd like the police to know who we are, what we're doing, where we're going. But in no way at all would we like to be a direct affiliation with the police department, because the police department has alienated itself in a lot of communities.
Tempted to break a stunned little Byron silence and intervene with a carping remark or two at this stage. And I think the argument is to go back in many respects. The conversation that we've been having tonight tends to take a funny turn, and it's hard to see when the conversation stops focusing on one thing and starts focusing on the other. There are two issues here. The one that I'm quite sympathetic to is the notion of generalized citizen responsibility for the control of crime, and shouldering the responsibilities for doing that. And it seems to me that when Mr. Sliwa talks about that, he is talking from a very strong position and from a very, both in traditional and in substantive terms. There is a slightly second issue, which is the future of the Guardian Angels as an institution. And I can understand that Mr. Sliwa would have a strong interest in protecting that institution and seeing it survive and sustain itself. And for that, one needs both friends and enemies, and particularly enemies in a world where you're relying primarily on the motivation and desire of your members to participate and think of themselves as being something special and important. But if we begin focusing our attention on what the on the survivability of the Guardian Angels as an institution, and indeed you hear the tendency not only to want them to survive, but to assume additional responsibilities, take care of the straying children in the cities, replace the police, yet none of these things are things that Mr. Sliwa talked about at the outset, and it seems to me to be a great mistake to imagine either, it seems to me a great mistake to imagine that they could assume substantially greater responsibilities, and certainly a great mistake to imagine that the police are their enemies rather than a necessary complement to what they are doing. And it seems to me the lesson that they have to teach us is not that the Guardian Angels as an institution are a special thing, all right, and a special capability that on which we are now going to load all our hopes in desperation at the failure of other institutions. But rather, they remind us that no confidence in the long run can be placed in any particular institution, and that in a democracy, that in the end, effective governance and attractive communities and a decent and happy life depends on each of our own capability to make our own way and to help others make their way in the society. So I think for us to want to once again load up an institution with special responsibilities, rather than to accept the burden of Mr. Sliwa's challenge and message, which is accept the responsibility, is to make the same error that we've made in the past. And I think that if I put the challenging question to Mr. Sliwa, if you had a choice between having lots of people accept the kind of responsibility that the Angels have accepted, but without accepting membership in the organization, which would he rather have?
I think it's clearly obvious that the best effect of the Guardian Angels is when they'll be able to retire the red berets and T-shirts, because it's no longer to be able to portray themselves as the good guys and the good gals, so that they just blend back into society as a normal functioning member who doesn't have to siphon themselves off and clearly identify themselves as having one intended purpose. So it's not an idea that the red beret and the T-shirt must begin to assume greater and greater importance, but hopefully less and less importance, because we've had more and more of an effect on the philosophy of what motivates people to getting involved.
Okay, we'll go to your question now.
I'd like to ask Mr. Sliwa regarding the issue brought up by the young man who spoke 2 questions ago about a school group that had been set up emulating the Guardian Angels. I was wondering if there had been any problems with groups that have been set up using the Guardian Angel image for their own profit, either taking this and acting almost as a protection group, asking money for it, or using it as an excuse to commit violence, borrowing either the idea of the T-shirts or the red hat. I'd like to ask Professor Wilson if there's been any incidents of this occurring in other groups, whereas he mentioned through history either the watchdog groups that occurred before the police or the recent ones that started since 1964, whether they were plagued by any of those problems.
Well, number one, with the kind of national reputation that we now have, and clearly if you live in the west, east, north, or south, there are groups in some urban areas that you can identify with that are legitimate Guardian Angels. But there are always people who will claim to be representing the Guardian Angels, or trying to set up a unit of the Guardian Angels, or generally younger people, not generally, I wouldn't say misguided, but thinking that maybe putting on a red beret and people will think that they're a Guardian Angel. There have been a few incidents, but nothing of a major act in which a whole group of people donned the shirts and berets and went out and committed any violence. And generally, once we are asked if these people are Guardian Angels and they are told no, they just disappear because there's no credibility. But you have to understand.
Why would you claim them? What's the danger of claiming them?
Well, first of all, they haven't been screened. We don't know who they are. Obviously, the concept hasn't been explained to them. I mean, they're going based on what they read in the newspapers, radio, and TV. If you were just to go by that, and then suddenly put a red beret and a T-shirt on, I'd have to question, the reasons that you're getting involved. Because as you could see in journalism today, particularly TV journalism, let's say the whole impact is on sensationalism. So that if you were to be with the Guardian Angels for 6 hours, you would take 20 seconds of the most sensational part of those 6 hours that may not be a reflection of the concept at all. So I would have to not only disown them, I would vehemently disown them in the fact that they're not even aware of the concept fully, and they're going to go out there and claim to be something that they're not. It's almost as if to claim to be a student of Harvard University because of the stature and the credibility, and being a big guy around town, and then suddenly not owning up to the fact that you're not a student. That's if to say, well, if you go someplace else like Southern Connecticut or this school or that school, you're not equivalent to anybody here. I say, fine. If you're determined to be a Guardian Angel, you've got to be able to live up to the standards, because the standards are very severe.
There have been examples to complete the answer to your question. Groups that began with performing either a vigilante or watchman function that began to practice extortion. Some of those were as recent as 40 or 50 years ago, and they will no doubt reappear. I'm not alleging that this group has those tendencies at all, but it is a problem about which one must be vigilant.
Question from the second floor.
Yes, I'd like to direct this to Mr. Sliwa. 2 questions, slightly related. One is, I know you do what you do very well. I'm wondering how willing the Guardian Angels, sort of related to the question about runaways, will be in the future to become involved in a process that you've rejected, namely the political process, specifically in regards to gun control, which I see as something that possibly you have an interest in a common goal that you might have in common with the police department. The second question is, what can people who can't be guardian angels do, especially if you indict the political process, the brainiacs, and the volunteerism, as you put it? Question, people who won't make it to that guardian angel standard.
Right, well, remember, the basis of the guardian angels is volunteer service. And we've had a lot of people come and go who, in a period of 2 or 3 years, created a lot of sensationalism, a lot of limelight. And the attitude is usually, we've seen this act before. Slick Sliwa is like the rest of these cats. Comes before the microphone, talks the good Samaritan rap. But, he's going to write his book, kick back, go to Hollywood, make his movie, run for Congress, and that's the end of the guardian angels. Who am I to disagree? If I was in the audience, I'd probably be thinking the same way. This is the American mentality. You know, if you can score, you score. I'm not going to try to brainwash you into thinking that I'm going to be with this group for the rest of my life and devote my entire activities to it. But the overall focus, aside from the fact of being able to retire the red, gray, and T-shirt, is to get, exactly as the young lady pointed out, young people who are not qualified to become guardian angels involved in other volunteer activities. So, to put it very simply, let's say 20 or 30 years down the line, to become what the Peace Corps and Vista should have become, but without all the bureaucratic red tape and political inefficiency, on a volunteer basis. That means on a very communal level. The middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, an old woman feels that somebody's breaking and entering in your house. She doesn't need somebody in a red beret and a T-shirt to come to her door. As long as there's a young person in the community, maybe they could get a phone call, hop on a bicycle, go over there, see what she needs. Because she could call the police department until she's blue in the face. You know she's not going to get a squad car there. Now, can the guardian angel there, that volunteer without a shirt and beret, do anything? No, but he certainly can give her the sensitivity that she cannot get from the political establishment or the officials or all the other agencies that have been set up supposedly to provide social service. So I think that's the main intent of the guardian angels in the future. But when just thinking of the natural process of how the political establishment moves, I'd say in terms of gun control, I have very real problems in that I don't carry a weapon, but I don't feel I have the right to deny anybody who's capable and qualified of bearing a weapon. I don't think that's something that I should be able to do, just based on my opinion, although I don't carry any weapons. But secondly, in getting involved politically, absolutely not. I could think of nothing greater. I might as well put myself in a straitjacket, throw myself in a rubber room, and bounce myself off the walls. We can have more of an impact on the outside as real bangers, just banging away at them, left and right, every time they drop their guard in this regard towards public safety and the rights of individuals. Every time they say something out of line, jump on their case, force them to answer the public, be the detractors, put them on the line. You can't do that from within the process. To do so from within the process means exclusion from the process. So you might as well do it from the outside. And that's basically the guardian angel principle. That doesn't necessarily reflect the individual sentiments of the group.
Since we're nearly out of time, we have time for just one last question, and I believe you've been waiting the longest, so you have the honor.
For Mr. Sliwa, I teach delinquent teenagers from the communities of East Boston, South Boston, and Charlestown. I suppose you may be familiar with the types of communities they are here in Boston, but they tend to be very proud and ethnically proud of their backgrounds. And they wouldn't readily accept your concepts of the guardian angels in the makeup of the crew or the factor of not going for revenge when you're attacked. And I'm wondering if you found these things in Boston so far, or how you go about solving that sort of thing.
Well, see, by once again not being parochial, when you're in a specific neighborhood, you're under peer pressure. If you're Italian, you got to swing with the Italians. You're Irish, you swing with the Irish. You're black, you're Hispanic, you swing with your own kind. Not to do so, you're looked upon as an outsider. But here is a group that represents everyone. So if you are basically a strong individual and would like to break away, and you get involved with the organization that deals with the entire city's needs, and then you come back to your own community, and people within your own community saying, hey, what are you going downtown to patrol the trains in the downtown area? Don't you think we have crime in this community? Then you come back to the chapter leader and say, hey, I'm catching hell in my community. They're saying, what am I going down to? Well, why don't you help set up a chapter in your neighborhood to develop the concept there, to begin to train the young peoples of that neighborhood to provide the safety that's necessary for the elderly and the special areas of particular need. And that's how the concept expands. And that's when you start seeing the detachment of the affiliation of ethnic qualities or neighborhood qualities, because the shirt and the beret has a tremendous quality of breaking down those divisions. One thing was said to me in Boston when I first came here, the very end of spring. No way in the world are you going to get black and young white people to work together. They laughed in my face. Mayor White, police chief, was saying, this guy, what a fool. We don't even have to say anything negative about him. He's hoping to do the impossible. And from the very first day I said, if there's anything we can do in Boston, if we can't eliminate crime, if we don't catch one mugger or rapist, if we just get people's working with one another, we're contributing in this city in a way that no other group or no other entity has done so in the past 100 years. And I'd feel very proud in just being able to get people at least to start talking together, never mind working together. And I think we've achieved that.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.